I'd just bought my piece of the American dream until the night an army of police crashed my porch and tried to make me the criminal. They picked the wrong house and the wrong man. The steam from the shower was still fogging up the bathroom mirror when the world outside my front door decided to explode. It had been a long, soul-crushing day. 12 hours of surveillance in a cramped van, staring at a warehouse that smelled like old fish, all for a target who never even showed. All I wanted was a hot meal, a cold beer, and the blessed silence of my own home. I'd just bought the place 3 months ago, a nice 2-story colonial in a quiet, tree-lined suburb. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved as they jogged by and left cookies on your doorstep as a welcome gift. It was my piece of the American dream, earned with a decade of service and a mountain of paperwork. I was toweling off when I heard it. Not a knock, but a bang. The kind of sound that doesn't ask for permission. A deep, percussive thud that rattled the old window panes in their frames. My heart, which had been winding down for the night, instantly kicked back into high gear. My training took over before my conscious mind could even process the noise. I wrapped the towel around my waist, my movements swift and silent, and crept towards the front of the house. I peered through the peephole, and my blood ran cold. Blue and red lights were strobing silently, painting my manicured lawn in frantic, pulsating colors. And on my porch, an army. It looked like the entire local police department had decided to hold a convention on my welcome mat. I counted at least 10 officers in full tactical gear, their faces grim, their hands resting on their sidearms. One officer, a portly sergeant with a mustache that looked like a dead squirrel, was raising his fist to hammer on my door again. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and opened the door. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked, my voice calm and level, a practiced tone I'd used on everyone from terrified witnesses to hardened criminals. The sergeant's eyes swept over me, from my bare feet up to my damp hair. A smirk played on his lips. "We got a call," he said, his voice a low growl. "B&E in progress. Suspicious individual matching your description." I felt a familiar, weary anger begin to bubble in my chest. I was a 6'2" black man in a predominantly white neighborhood. I knew exactly what suspicious individual meant. "Officer," I said slowly, keeping my hands visible and open at my sides, "there must be some mistake. This is my house. I live here." He chuckled, a short, ugly sound. "Yeah, that's what they all say. We're gonna need to see some ID." "Of course," I replied. "It's in my wallet, on the table just inside. If you'll just let me—" I made to turn, to point towards the small entryway table where I'd tossed my keys and wallet. "Freeze!" another officer shouted, his hand flying to his holster. The whole group tensed, a ripple of aggression passing through them. It was like watching a pack of wolves scent blood. The sergeant stepped forward, invading my personal space. His hand landed firmly on my chest, pushing me back against the doorframe. "You're not going anywhere. We'll get your ID. Where is it? My patience, already worn thin from a grueling day, was starting to fray. As I just said, I stated, my voice turning to ice, it's on the table right there, in my jacket pocket. And while you're at it, you should probably take a look at my credentials. The sergeant's eyes narrowed. Credentials? What, you got a library card you're real proud of? Some of the other cops snickered. The humiliation was a physical thing, hot and prickly on my skin. My neighbor's curtains were twitching. The whole street was watching. No, Sergeant, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I'm a federal agent, FBI. The laughter was immediate and derisive. The sergeant actually threw his head back and let out a loud guffaw. An FBI agent? Son, I was born at night, but not last night. You look more like a suspect than a Fed to me. He turned to two of his officers. Cuff him! Before I could even protest, my arms were wrenched behind my back with brutal efficiency. The cold steel bit into my wrists, tight enough to cut off the circulation. They were shoving me off my own porch, treating me like a common criminal. The sergeant, still smirking, stepped past me into my house. Let's go see about these credentials, he sneered, walking over to the coat rack where my work jacket hung. He reached into the inner pocket, his movements full of theatrical mockery, and pulled out my leather wallet. He flipped it open, and his entire demeanor changed. The smirk vanished, the color drained from his face, and his eyes went wide. He froze, staring down at the gold shield and the unmistakable identification card that read, Special Agent Michael Thompson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. A silence fell over the porch, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the crackle of a police radio and the frantic beating of my own heart against my ribs. The sergeant stared at my credentials as if they were a venomous snake poised to strike. For a moment I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes, the dawning horror of a man realizing he's just stepped on a landmine. I thought, okay, this is where he backs down. This is where he apologizes and they all quietly disappear. I was wrong. Pride is a dangerous thing, and that sergeant's pride had just been grievously wounded. He snapped the wallet shut with a sharp crack and shoved it back into my jacket, which was still hanging inside my house. He turned to me, his face a mask of furious denial. Fake, he spat, the word hanging in the cold night air. That's a damn good fake. Where'd you get it? Online? I stared at him, dumbfounded by the sheer stubborn stupidity of his accusation. Sergeant, I said, my voice dangerously low. My badge number is 7824B. I work out of the downtown Federal Building, Violent Crimes Task Force. My supervisor is ASAC David Chen. His direct line is programmed into my phone, which is on the same table as my wallet. I suggest you use it. Every word was a nail in his professional coffin, and he knew it, but he was in too deep. He had an audience of his subordinates and my entire neighborhood. To back down now would be to lose face completely. So he doubled down.
You think I'm an idiot? You're obstructing our investigation, and now you're impersonating a federal officer. That's a serious felony, son.
He turned to his men, his voice booming with false authority. Get him in the car. We'll sort this out at the station. A few of the younger officers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. They'd seen the ID. They knew how bad this could get. But the sergeant's glare was enough to get their feet moving. They hauled me down my own porch steps, my bare feet scraping against the concrete walkway. The humiliation was a physical burn. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors, people I'd shared polite nods with, now watching me get frog-marched into the back of a squad car like a common thief. The door slammed shut, sealing me in a cage of plastic and plexiglass. The ride to the station was a surreal nightmare. I remained silent, my training kicking in, forcing me to compartmentalize the rage. I became an observer, a collector of facts. I noted the time. I memorized the officers' badge numbers. I listened to the radio chatter, the casual way they reported they had the suspect in custody. They were building a narrative, a lie, to cover their tracks. When we arrived at the station, they paraded me through the squad room as if I were a prize catch. The sergeant, whose name I learned was Miller, personally booked me. He took my fingerprints. He made me pose for a mugshot, the flashbulb searing a fresh layer of indignation into my soul, all while I wore nothing but a damp towel, which they'd condescendingly allowed me to keep wrapped around my waist. They put me in a holding cell. The air was cold and smelled of disinfectant and despair. Sergeant Miller stood on the other side of the bars, a triumphant smirk back on his face. "You get one phone call," he said, dangling the precinct phone's receiver like a piece of meat. "Better make it a good one. Maybe call that supervisor of yours." I looked him dead in the eye, my face devoid of all emotion. "I will," I said softly. He slid the phone through the slot. I picked it up, the plastic cool against my ear. I didn't call ASAC Chen. Chen was a good boss, but he was a bureaucrat. For a situation this egregious, you don't call a manager. You call a weapon. I dialed a number I knew by heart, a number that wasn't on any official contact list. It rang twice. A gravelly voice answered. "Yeah?" "Director Evans," I said, my voice steady. "It's Special Agent Thompson. I have a situation." I heard a chair scrape on the other end of the line, the sound of a man coming to full, immediate attention. "Michael, what is it? Where are you?" "I'm at the Northwood Precinct," I said, my eyes locked on Sergeant Miller, who was watching from his desk with a smug look. "I've been arrested at my home. I'm currently in a holding cell." I paused, letting the words sink in. "And they think my credentials are fake." There was a beat of pure, unadulterated silence on the other end of the line. When Director Evans spoke again, his voice was no longer gravelly. It was an Arctic tundra. "Stay put, Michael. Don't say another word to anyone. I'm handling it." The line went dead. I placed the receiver back on the cradle and slid it back through the slot. Sergeant Miller chuckled, shaking his head. "The director, huh? You got a big imagination, I'll give you that." He leaned back in his chair, propping his feet up on his desk, the picture of smug satisfaction. He thought he'd won. He had no idea he'd just started a clock, and when it hit 0, his entire world was going to be reduced to rubble. It took less than 15 minutes. The first sign that the apocalypse was coming for Sergeant Miller was the sudden, frantic energy that seized the squad room. A dispatcher's voice, tight with panic, crackled over the intercom. A detective burst out of a back office, his eyes wide, and made a beeline for the precinct captain's door. Then the front doors of the station flew open with such force they slammed against the walls. In walked 4 men in dark, impeccably tailored suits. They moved with the quiet, predatory confidence that screamed federal. They didn't flash badges. They didn't need to. Their presence was a badge. The man in the lead, who I recognized as ASAC Chen, scanned the room, his gaze landing on the holding cell and then locking onto Sergeant Miller, who had just dropped his feet to the floor with a thud. "Where is he?" Chen demanded, his voice echoing in the now silent room. Miller, pale and sweating, could only point a trembling finger towards my cell. Chen strode over, followed by the others, their polished shoes clicking ominously on the linoleum floor. He looked at me through the bars, his expression a mixture of fury and concern. "Are you all right, Agent Thompson?" "I'm fine, sir," I said. "Just a little chilly." Chen's jaw tightened. He turned to a bewildered-looking officer, fumbling with a ring of keys. "Open it, now." The cell door swung open. As I stepped out, one of the agents draped a blanket over my shoulders. Another handed me a set of clothes they'd evidently retrieved from my house. No one spoke to Miller. They acted as if he didn't exist, a ghost in his own precinct. That was worse than yelling. It was the calm, methodical dismantling of a man's career. The precinct captain finally emerged from his office, his face ashen. He'd clearly just had the worst phone call of his life. "ASAC Chen," he stammered. "There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Chen turned to face him, his eyes like chips of ice. "A misunderstanding? Captain, one of my best agents was assaulted, illegally detained, and booked on fabricated charges by your sergeant here, all while standing on his own property. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a 5-alarm constitutional crisis, and your department is ground zero." He then looked past the captain, his gaze sweeping over the 15 or so officers who had been on my lawn or in the station. "Everyone involved in this fiasco, consider yourselves on administrative leave, effective immediately. Your firearms, your badges, on your captain's desk. You will be contacted by Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice." A wave of shock and fear washed over the room. Sergeant Miller looked like he was going to be sick. He opened his mouth to protest, to say something, anything, but Chen cut him off with a single sharp gesture. "As for you, Sergeant," Chen said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper, You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you exercise it." The aftermath was swift and brutal. My arrest was expunged before the ink on the booking report was dry. An internal investigation, spearheaded by the DOJ, tore through the Northwood Police Department like a hurricane. Sergeant Miller was fired, of course, stripped of his pension, and faced federal charges for civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. The 14 other officers present were all either fired or suspended indefinitely, their careers in ruins. The city, staring down the barrel of a lawsuit from the federal government itself, scrambled to settle. They offered a public apology and a financial settlement that was astronomical: $7 million. It wasn't about the money for me. It was about the principle. It was about what that number represented, an admission of guilt so profound, so undeniable, that it could never be swept under the rug. I never went back to that house on the tree-lined street. The memory of the flashing lights, the sneering faces, the cold steel on my wrists. It was a stain that wouldn't wash out. I sold it and moved downtown, closer to the Federal Building. Some nights, when I'm working late and the city is quiet, I think about Sergeant Miller. I wonder if he ever understands the sheer magnitude of his mistake. He didn't just arrest a black man in a towel. He arrested the wrong black man. And in doing so, he brought the full, terrifying weight of the United States government down on his own head. He pulled a thread, and his entire world unraveled.